Welcome to another edition of Gridiron Nation on TSN. He's Gordon Studio Land. I'm Jim on Football Island, and let's get right to it. The top 5 Canadians in the NCAA in our weekly Stateside 5. Let's start out with a big day for the defense. In at 5, Jalen Smith, 6 tackles, 4 of them solo. Unfortunately, North Texas lost 52-24 to Memphis. Jet Elad in at 4, 6 tackles, shared a TFL and a big win over Oregon State. 4 receptions, 55 yards, and a touchdown for Alec Iomanner, but it wasn't enough in a lopsided loss to SMU. Rutgers linebacker Daryl Jabome in at number 2, 11 tackles overall, half a TFL, and a pass defended in a narrow loss to UCLA. And speaking up for the offense, it is Kurtis Rourke, the quarterback for Indiana, in just one half of play, 17 of 21, for 189 yards, a TD and an INT, and an absolute dismantling of Nebraska. So a great first half for Kurtis Rourke, good enough to have him in the number 1 spot in the Stateside 5, considering he was playing a team like Nebraska of that quality and putting up that many points and running a fantastic offense. Even before this game, though, there were stories coming out that he was a top 5 or a top 10 Heisman candidate. That's a big leap for him. Is it premature?
No, I don't think so. I don't know how you can argue with that at this point in time. And you know, one of the things for Kurtis is that he's a very veteran guy at this level. This is now his 6th year at the level, and he's playing like a veteran player. It used to be that guys would kind of be discriminated against for having that much time under their belt before they really blew up. But as we've seen in recent years, you know, guys like Michael Penix and Bo Nix, like we've seen prolific quarterbacks at this level that have taken that time to find their way and taking their time to find the right system as well. Both those guys, of course, didn't blow up until after they transferred too. So I think in the world of the transfer portal and the post-COVID world in NCAA, that's become a little bit more normalized and palatable. And so back to Kurtis, if you look at the metrics across the board, he's been one of the elite in the country this season. And I think it's also helped his case. Like, he's playing at an incredibly high level. His PFF grade is over 90 for the season still, which is elite. I think what has helped his case too, though, is that there hasn't necessarily been slam dunk seasons from some of the other big names that were in the quarterback conversation, the potential Heisman conversation. Cam Ward has been every bit the Heisman contender. He's been outstanding. Shedeur Sanders has been very good for most of the season as well. But you know, Quinn Ewers got benched this past week. You know, Carson Beck was better this week, but it was not great against Alabama. Jalen Milroe can't stop throwing interceptions. Like, there have been a lot of hiccups from guys that might have stolen that spotlight from a Kurtis Rourke. And when you factor in that the narrative around his team is also one of the best in the country right now, and everything is kind of rolling his way. So I think everything also lays out pretty well for him to finish strong. That really, at this point in time, the bar has been reset, that their only game that I think is going to be a real likelihood of a loss is that they do have to play Ohio State. But that's about it. Like, and so I think it's going to set up pretty nicely for Kurtis to continue to have some pretty solid numbers, and it may all come down to that Ohio State game. Can he keep them in that game and keep them competitive against an Ohio State squad that has just been a powerhouse this season and looks destined to be a real national championship contender? So I think that's where things are really going to boil down to for Kurtis, and of course also staying healthy, which we had a bit of a scare this past weekend, and he's had some injury issues in the past. So that's also, I guess, the variable to watch out for.
We know that the Heisman is a quarterback-y type of award, and you mentioned some of the quarterbacks that he may be in contention with. But look at some of the other position groups, maybe running back, for example. Is there anybody else that would be a strong challenge to him?
Well, you're right. It is a quarterback-y type award usually, but this is a really good year for it setting up to be a non-quarterback. And it not unprecedented by any means. It just tends to favor quarterbacks because they're so central to offenses. But you've got 2 guys that are kind of breaking the mold. And we've talked about Ashton Jeanty on this show. I don't think that I need to say much more of him at this point in time. Although a stat I did see this week is that he has almost doubled the second place guy in terms of missed tackles forced this season. It's like 56-31 or something like that. That is incredible and just shows that this guy is next level. Then the other guy that I think breaks the mold and is a real front runner at this point, though he did get hurt this past weekend, so that's why I keep an eye on, is Travis Hunter. And he breaks the mold because he's a two-way guy, right? And he came out with a quote this week. I was actually a little critical of him for saying it this forthright, but he basically said, like, Genty's doing great things, but he's doing things that we've seen before. I'm doing things that nobody else is doing and nobody else has done. And that does kind of sum up his case. He's playing both sides of the ball at a high level. NFL scouts are legitimately split on whether he's better suited as a wide receiver or a corner at the next level. And that just goes to show you that, this guy's probably All-American level at both positions right now, and he's doing both. So hopefully his health holds up and makes that not a deciding factor in this. But those two guys are the guys that I think are actually leading the charge right now, with Cam Ward, to me, being the third guy kind of on the fringe of that conversation.
So we got a ton of buzz about an offensive player playing the glamour position on the team that is not just the flavor of the week or the flavor of the month, so far the flavor of the season in Indiana, but the real story for Canadian players. It's on the defensive side of the ball, Gord.
Yeah, it is. And we saw a great weekend from some of the defenders that we've been talking about this season. Like Dario Jabome, this has been a great story. This guy, we didn't really know who he was 5 weeks ago. And now all of a sudden, he's locked into just being a tackling machine. Double-digit tackles basically week in, week out, no matter how things are going for Rutgers. They win games, he's racking up tackles. They get boat raced a little bit, and he's racking up tackles. And they lose a tight one, and he's still racking up tackles. Turns out whatever happens right now, Dario Jabome is in the middle of it and cleaning stuff up. He's been outstanding for them. And has also been a PFF favorite, I would point out, too. Jet Elad had another great week this week as UNLV had a big win on the road. Jalen Smith led North Texas in tackles this week. So all of a sudden, we're starting to see some of these names pop up on the defensive side of the ball. We haven't necessarily had guys with the sparkling standout statistics, right? We've talked about this on the show in years past, but if a defensive guy is going to break through and, say, be a real contender for the Cornish Trophy, he kind of needs to be recording more than just a whole bunch of tackles, right? We saw an Eamon Ogbongbemiga, for example, rack up a whole bunch of tackles and still come up short because they're those big time explosion splash plays, interceptions, sacks, etc. weren't necessarily jumping off the page for them. And that is one thing that we're seeing from a lot of our defenders, is that they're playing very, very good defense, but they're not necessarily doing those star explosive plays that would force us to really take the attention on them to the next level. But that doesn't downplay what it's been, and it's been great to see some new names appear and really take the spotlight. Of course, I should have mentioned Ty Benefield. They were off this weekend, which is why I didn't, but he's in that conversation too.
Thanks for that, Gord. Stick around. We'll have some U Sports for you coming up next on The Nation. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation on TSN, everyone. Time for some U Sports talk, and we're joined by Darren Dupont, the voice of the Canada West. And Darren, when we were just off air, you were congratulating Gord Randall for getting up off the mat, Undertaker style, when it comes to his Canada West picks. We were all over him. We were busting his chops about it earlier this year. Go ahead, give him some love.
Yes, Jim, congratulations. It's a hard thing to do. Like, I understood the tough start because the Canada West has been so unpredictable. So even more impressive that you were able to climb out of the hole, not just get your record respectable, but I think you're in first place, right? So good for you.
Yeah, a couple gutsy calls mixed in there, but it's also a good illustration of what the Canada West is like. Like, I compare our group of pickers in the Canada West with the group of pickers that At the 55 podcast is doing for the OUA, and I think the worst record of the six of them is like 23-11 or something like that, right? Whereas for us going into this week, the best record of all of us was 9-9. And I feel like that's a good illustration of the difference in the dynamics between the two conferences. The OUA, as good as some of the football can be in the OUA, is a much more predictable conference in terms of the pecking order, and the C-Dub is always up and down and all over the place. And so you think you know something about the C-Dub? I'm not gonna take any victory laps yet, because we still got a couple weeks to go, and the bottom could fall just as quickly as I built it back up again. So who knows?
Do you think, Darren, that the bottom's going to fall out on the Manitoba Bisons? They rallied with 20 unanswered points to force overtime, find a way to a win against Alberta. Alberta never fails to disappoint in big games, it seems, over the last 20 years, unfortunately for them. But what do you think about this Manitoba team as they go headlong into a game against UBC?
Yeah, we were just getting off the air in the U Prairie Challenge as that game was, coming to its conclusion in the fourth quarter. And all I'm watching is the out-of-town scoreboard and seeing the score get closer and closer. And every time I look, Manitoba had the ball again. And then we watched Maya Turner kick the game-tying field goal and then what transpired in overtime. Look, I was getting worried for Brian Dobie's Manitoba Bisons. I really was. You lose to Saskatchewan, who's getting better, and then you lose to Alberta, and all of a sudden you lose 2 in a row going into UBC, who's won 5 in a row. And I'm wondering if this is just going to go right the opposite way, but they turn it around. And, that's a win that they can rally around and kind of say, no, we got this back on track. And they're a good football team. They're a veteran football team. So I think that was a really, really important way to finish off that game, to kind of set them up. Now this UBC game, whatever happens, isn't quite as big of a deal as if they were coming in off 2 straight losses.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things they fixed up in that second half was that the secondary was pretty leaky in the first half. And for such a veteran group back there for Manitoba, that was a bit surprising given that Eli Hetlinger wasn't playing. It was Cade Lebrecht under center for the Golden Bears. But in the second half, they really flipped that script and put the clamps down on the Alberta offense that had a really good first half. I think that's what changed. And when you look at this game coming up, Manitoba's at home for this one, so they get the home field advantage for it. Weather, at least as of this point, granted we're pretty far out, but as of this point, it looks like it's not going to be too bad. But I think the dynamics between the two teams have changed a little bit. Manitoba, I think, really needed that morale boost because UBC has turned its season around significantly. And what's been really impressive with UBC over the last month or so is they found ways to win in different ways. Garrett Rooker, guys, he threw for 30 yards on Friday as they beat Calgary in a monsoon out here in Vancouver. But they found ways to, they weathered that storm and they found ways to weather some different storms over the last few months. What'll come down to, I think, is, and this has been the case for UBC the last couple of years, it's going to be, can they establish the run and get Isaiah Knight going? If Isaiah Knight is going, and we're talking comfortably over 100 yards of rushing, then I really like UBC's chances. But they have not shown the ability to be able to drive the offense through the air purely this year. And so if they become one-dimensional that way, Manitoba can put the stops in the rushing attack, then I like Manitoba's chances. But it should be a really interesting one.
So Western demolishes Windsor in their final contest, and then Laurier goes 8-0, runs the table in the regular season. We're on a collision course for the Yates Cup between Western and Laurier. I'm going to pencil it in really dark pencil for these two teams for the Yates Cup. And, of course, in Quebec, we've got Montreal and Laval that look like they're on a collision course. Darren, do you think we should be happy or have some level of consternation about seeing two favorites practically being booked for a final contest like this?
Look, I'm a Canada West guy. I love the conference because even today, we just talked about Manitoba UBC, but, Alberta, Saskatchewan, heck, Regina, anybody could be in the Hardy Cup. And that's what's fun about it. All the games are unpredictable and you never know what's going to happen. But I think if you're a fan of good football, I think we should be happy because you're going to get really great championship games. Like to see 2 games, Montreal and Laval, go to overtime, both decided by a point either way. How can you not be excited to watch that game? And in the OUA too, you're going to get a great game. Taylor Elgersma was kind of his coming out party. Like his real statement game was the win over Western in the regular season. He's continued to dominate. It'll be fun to see him do that again with more on the line. And there's still some other good stories. Like we do like parity. York's been a better story this year. I've liked McMaster getting better and becoming a playoff team. Guelph's a good story. So there are some other good stories. Overall, we'd like to see more parity, but you're going to see great football anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, this year's Laurier squad reminds me a little bit of my 2009 Queen squad in that it feels like this has been building for a few years. They finally get over the Western hump in the regular season, and now the question remains, can they get over that Western hump all the way through? And the nature of the two teams, both being led by prolific passing attacks this year, also reminds me of that Queens Western dynamic back in 2009 when it was Michael Falls and Danny Brannigan dueling it out. Now it's Taylor Elgersma and Evan Hillick, who's a guy that quietly has been nipping right at Elgersma's heels in a lot of statistical categories and been putting up a lot of similar numbers to Elgersma, and they come up just short when they played Laurier. Plus, people still think of Western as this ground and pound team. It'll be interesting to see as we shift into November here in the next couple of weeks. if Western does start to shift that identity a little bit, or if they do continue to be a little bit more pass heavy than they have traditionally been under Greg Marshall. That's one of the interesting dynamics I'm looking for there.
Quickly, while we have a moment here, we don't talk about the AUS too much, but Bishops has had an impressive season. We're always waiting for that special AUS team to really give a push to a champion. In this case, they're going to be playing the OUA champion if they survive the AUS playoffs. Do you think they're capable of carrying a game into the third or fourth quarter? Gord?
Yeah, I mean, they're another team that's been knocking on the door in their conference pecking order for the last couple of years, right? And St. FX was kind of a dynasty in that conference for the better part of a decade, and Bishops has quietly risen up to and now surpassed them to be the top dog out there. But I mean, I don't want to go out on a limb and say that they're going to take somebody deep in a national semifinal. I watch the score lines, and in particular, I watch the fact that there's not a lot of offense on a consistent basis when I'm looking at these score lines. And that, for me, is something that I'm looking for if I'm looking for an AUS team that's going to be able to compete at the national stage. Are they athletic enough on offense? Do they have the ability to put up the fireworks on offense to potentially outscore what will likely be a very challenged defense against a different conference's champions? So I just don't think that nature is there, but stranger things have happened, I guess. There's nothing that's really jumping off the page for me that's making me say with any kind of confidence that this is going to be the time that things change for the AUS.
But it does make it really exciting, doesn't it? A little bit, the intrigue and the unknown of where do they stack up. And that'll make the game at least a little, it'll be fun, the build-up leading up to it. It kind of reminds me, of the NCAA season and Army-Navy and how much fun everybody's had around their undefeated starts and how great they've been. But we know if they have to play a Texas or a Georgia or an Alabama or somebody, it's probably not going to go their way. But we're kind of fun to say, just what if, right? What if? Where do they stack up? So I think that will be fun when we get to the national semi for a quarter or two, maybe, hopefully.
Well, and in a similar dynamic, just like Army and Navy south of the line, it's nice to be able to talk about Bishops having relevance again, right? If they do make it through and get the Loney Bowl and go to the national semifinal, I believe that'll be their first appearance in one since the early 1990s. Right? But historically, this has been a very influential program in that part of the country, produced a ton of CFLers, et cetera, et cetera. So to have them back and part of the conversation at all, I think is nice and refreshing.
But they will not be Canada's Vanderbilt against Alabama. No way, no how. When we return, we will have Dave Naylor of TSN with us. Stick around. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation, everyone. Now joined by TSN's Dave Naylor. Dave, good to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
A Carleton grad from the vaunted journalism program. After you've had this route that's gone through newspapers to television, covering all sports, how did you end up landing on football? Is it because it's your passion? Is it because it's where the road took you? How did you end up covering this sport and being the TSN insider?
Part of it was when I came into the business in 1991, everybody seemed to be wanting to do baseball or do hockey. And football just became the sport that fell into my lap. And, I recognized a few things about it very early. One was it was, to me, the most meaningful sport when you're talking about covering games. Every game has a meaning in football. The way people come to football, there's so much variety in that. People who play it all their lives, people who come to it late, people who come to it from tough backgrounds, people who come from it from wealthy it's just a football locker room is one of the most diverse places, both in terms of, backgrounds and storytelling that you can find. But when I look back, Jim, I think I kind of had a leaning towards football maybe earlier than I thought. And I should be clear, I never played the game. My high school didn't have a team. I probably wouldn't have made it if they did. But, I did, and you mentioned I did have a journalism degree from Carleton. My honors project was a 23-minute television documentary on a semi-pro football team called the Ottawa Bootleggers, which was made up mostly of Carleton and Ottawa U guys who aged out of university ball, and they were playing 4-down football in the semi-pro circuit in the United States and actually competed for the national title, I guess the international title, in the fall of 1981 in Ottawa at Lansdowne Park against the Racine, Wisconsin Raiders. And so that was kind of my background while I was in school. And then when I got into the business, it was just kind of the open opportunity that opened up for me. And from there, my first job in broadcast was in Regina, Saskatchewan. I was the CBC radio reporter in Regina in 1994 and 1995. And guess what was the number one beat there every single day? It was CFL. It was football. And it was a real privilege to cover football in a market like Regina. I often joke when people say, what's the biggest story you've ever covered in your career, 30 plus years? I say, probably the day that Ray Yauch put Dave Ridgway on the practice roster. It was massive story in Regina because he got into a snit with an extremely popular kicker and player in that community. But that just from there, it just kind of took off from there. And I've absolutely loved and been very, very privileged to make my living for as long as I have in a sport that I never played.
In the conversations that I've had with you about college football, it seems that you've got a special place in your heart, or you're passionate about college football. Why so passionate about college football? And tell me a bit about some of the journeys that you've gone on to find stories over the last couple of years around the college game, especially associated with the Canadians.
I just find the hunger and the passion and the dedication at the collegiate football level to be so enticing. There's just nobody takes a play off. There's no meaningless games. Everybody, I think, understands from the moment they start playing college football that they're kind of on the clock individually as well, because it's not a sport that you can play for 10 years. It's not a sport where you can be really, really good and be stuck behind somebody. So when your opportunity comes along, you've got to really pursue it. And I think one of the things that I'll speak to the NCAA example for a moment. There is an incredible consistency when we visit college campuses about the Canadian kids that play Division I. I mean, you'd almost think they were brought up in the same households, because it's, these guys came here incredibly hardworking. These guys never caused any trouble. Our coach said, if I had 90 guys like X, my job would be so easy. They're also really good with the media. There's just a humility about them. And I've always kind of wondered, well, why is that? And I think part of it is, it's two things, I think. One, I think when you grow up as a hockey player in Canada, not to besmirch hockey, but you can be treated pretty specially by the time you're 12, 13, 14 years old. In your community, you're a big, big deal. I don't think football players get that kind of treatment at that age. You're more anonymous. You're working in the shadows. And the other thing about it is, particularly the NCAA, there's not one path. I'll use hockey again. I kind of describe it as a conveyor belt sport, right? The conveyor belt will carry you from Pee Wee to the NHL draft. You really don't have a lot of decision making to make in that. There's a pretty well-worn path, particularly in this country. But in football, every player invents their own road. Every player figures it out on their own and comes a different way. And so by the time they arrive at that level, I think they really value the opportunity that they've achieved, because they know what a long shot it is to get it. But I remember even so many examples, just one that pops into my head. We were in Champaign, Illinois about 2 years ago this time. And it was right when Chase Brown was getting a lot of love for the Heisman Trophy. And, Sid was about to pop the second half of that season. He was certainly still seen as a guy who was going to get drafted, but he really exploded the second half of that season. And we were taping our stand-up for SportsCenter at the end of the day, right in front of a statue outside the stadium or the admin building. And as we're doing it, the media relations guy who had helped us earlier in the day was leaving for the day. And as he walked by us, set up with our tripod and lights there, he just looked at it and said, hey, thanks for everything. The guy said, hey, you send us two more like Chase and Sid, you can go back anytime you want. It was, and I remember a similar thing with Jesse Luketa at Penn State, walking around with Jesse Luketa at Penn State. He was giving us the tour of everything. And just, you could tell by the way people engaged with him as he walked around, what a special kind of presence he had at that school, as a team captain and a guy who just given everything to that program. I often tell the story that we sent a list to Penn State when we were doing a feature on Jesse Luketa that, big list, right? Can we get James Franklin for a sit down? Can we get access to the stadium? Can we get access to a meeting room with a screen? A whole bunch of things. And I got the list back and it said, Yes, no, no, yes, maybe, no, yes. I called Jesse and I said, hey, could you put in a bit of a word with us on some of our requests here? Because we got a lot of maybes on this. And the next day I got an email and everything was green lit. And it was just like, it just showed me, what kind of standing he had at that school. So I have noticed some real consistencies when it comes to certainly the Canadians that are getting to the NCAA level.
So, when you were visiting those particular individuals that you're talking about, we were just before the NIL revolution. We were just before the shuffling around of conferences. If you were to take a look at the landscape of college football, and let's throw U Sports in with it too,
Sure.
if you're trying to explain it to someone who doesn't understand the college football landscape, be a cartographer, right? Draw a map for people. What would the map look like these days? And how many more of these borders can change, not only for conferences and programs, but for players as well? Because we're in the middle right now of a bit of a whirlwind, aren't we?
Well, the way I describe it to people, Jim, is I say college football went from the most restrictive system of free agency, basically in major competitive sport, to the least restrictive. And I think that has such a dramatic effect when you basically have a sport where to transfer out, you got to sit out a year and you got to really think about your future. And yeah, it happened, but as quickly, and I've noticed it even covering the Canadian Football League in such a short period of time, we see players coming here, and the first thing I'll do is look up their college pedigree. Where did they play? What did they do? And the number of guys who have shown up here with 3 colleges on their resumes, and you go, holy smokes, and you've seen that even with some of the Canadians. Look at a kid like Christian Veilleux, right, who's Penn State. He goes to Pitt. He gets his opportunity at Pitt. I was there the day he threw 4 interceptions at Notre Dame. And unfortunately, in this sport, this is one of the things I love about the sport. But occasionally, I don't like it. You get your opportunity. You get your 4 or 5 starts. If you don't make good of it, they're going to move on to somebody else, and that's what happened with him. But the way I would describe it is basically, you have the ability to plot your own path. And I know there's things people don't like about NIL and all the movement and things like that. I can't get past the fact that I think for players it's a good thing, as opposed to being stuck with a coach who maybe you're not the guy you're not his guy, or while you're there the coach changes and you say, hey, I came here to play for that guy, not for that guy, and the coach can go out the back door at the end of a college season, but a player can't, or just getting stuck behind playing second string behind a guy who's not coming off the field and he's only a year ahead of you, or he might even be in the same year. I do love the flexibility that it gives players, because you don't get that situation where you're just burning the clock. But I mean, it has become, it's really hard to say what college football is right now, because I feel like it's still in transition. I mean, we're heading towards the first 12-team playoff. I don't even know what that's going to look like. Is that going to be competitive, or are the early rounds of that not going to be competitive? Because we often see such a drop off, once you get past the top 4 or 5 teams. But look, I think college football today is a sport where there are opportunities for players, both in terms of compensation and in terms of where they want to play and find themselves, like there have never been. It's gone from a sport where the players are really not in the driver's seat. They've been in the back seat, and now they're driving.
Can 2 individuals have more of an effect on football in Canada than the Rourke brothers coming up in the next couple of years? Nathan in the CFL, we know there's some turbulence there around the Lions, but I expect him to pull out of that. He's got a good body of work. And Kurtis being mentioned as a top 5 Heisman candidate. It's too bad he's got that thumb injury that is going to force him to sit out against Washington. Both of these guys have the opportunity to make a seismic impact on this game in this country, don't you think?
Well, we can say already there's never been, brother tandem like that in Canadian football history, unless we're going back into the mists of time, But look, how long have we just talked about Canadian quarterbacks? Could we have one? One who was, and I'm not trying to knock guys like Bob Torrance or Larry Justanis, or guys who rose up and got opportunities to start, Julio Caravata. But I'm talking about that you would get a guy who's going to be a 5, 8, 10-year starter in the league. He's gonna be in competition for outstanding player. He's going to play in Grey Cups, and nobody's going to question his abilities because he's Canadian. And I think that was what was so interesting about Nathan Rourke in 2022. I'll put my hand up. I was one of those who was critical that offseason of the Lions making him their starter. Nothing to do with him being Canadian. I was just going from saying, hey, in all the years I've been watching Canadian football, I have not seen many guys play one season, get 2 starts, and be ready to be a starting quarterback in this league. That's just not a common path. And, if you wanted to broaden it a little bit, give me the list of guys from the Mid-American Conference who have come and taken this league by storm within a couple of years. It's just not something we've seen a lot. And the way Nathan Rourke played in 2022, he eliminated that conversation. And I had a great talk with Rick Campbell about week 2 or 3 of that season, where he kind of walked me through all the reasons why they did it. And I came away from that, with a much greater understanding that I had in the offseason. The fascinating thing about Kurtis Rourke is, I've had a chance to talk to their parents and find out a little bit of their upbringing. I mean, Nathan was the dog, right? Nathan was the one who football was always going to be his future from the moment, literally. I don't know if you guys know the story about him in the videotape?
Yeah,
you know the story?
I do, but you can share it with everyone here.
Yeah, real quickly. Nathan Rourke found a videotape, like in his father's closet, of the Green Bay Packers 1997 championship season. And his mother had a rule: the kids could watch 30 minutes of TV a day. You could watch Sesame Street, you could watch cartoons, you could watch, whatever you want. You could watch, but you get 30 minutes a day. Nathan watched the Packer highlight tape every single day. Every single day. He didn't want to watch kid stuff. He watched that. I mean, that's how early this was embedded in him as a dream that he was going to play professional football. He was literally a toddler when this is happening. And Kurtis kind of followed Big Brother. And then, Kurtis grew to 6'5", after he got to college. And I think it's a really interesting question about whether Kurtis, as a high school quarterback in Oakville, Ontario, would have got an opportunity to be a D1, to go to a D1 school, had people not just known his brother, but known the family and kind of known the whole background and the kind of commitment you were going to get from this player. But to see where he is now, and I talked to him, actually 7 days ago today. I had a good conversation with him, just coming out of their bye week. I got to see him in August when I was there visiting. He's a very calm guy. He rolls with the stuff, with the things that come in this sport. I'm sure he's handling the latest injury, the way he's learned to deal with the ups and downs of the sport. But I mean, look, I was optimistic for him. I remember last year I talked to him. I saw him play at the University of Buffalo. I think it was in November because it was darn cold. I remember that. And at that time, he was still leaning against playing again, that was going to be the end of his college football career. He gets the 6th season because of the COVID season in 20. And he told me a week ago, he said, looking back on that, I said, how close did you come from walking away from this and just taking your chances in the pros? He said, pretty close. And when he put his name in the portal, he said, I wasn't even sure anybody was going to want me coming out of the portal at that time. So, he caught lightning in a bottle with Curt Cignetti and this program at Indiana. They've caught lightning in a bottle with Kurtis Rourke. And I'm so disappointed because this next month was going to be tons of attention on that program, trying to stay undefeated, going up against Michigan, Washington, Ohio State. I know we expect he's going to be back before the end of the year, but I mean, what a duo to see these guys in the same season. Kurtis being in the NCAA, Nathan in both the NFL and the CFL. My goodness, Jim, I visited Nathan in July at Giants camp. That feels like 3 years ago. It doesn't feel like that was this season, but unprecedented. And look, Nathan's 26 and Kurtis is 24. There's a lot of their story in football still to be written.
Speaking of things that are written, I want to ask you a bit about the industry, actually, because I was raised on newspapers and radio. I went into newspapers and radio myself, similar to you. I was raised on, in my local papers, Jim Taylor, Archie McDonald, even Cam Cole as he came over from Edmonton. And each CFL city used to have those voices, used to have that level of literacy around the game. That's disappearing. How much does that hurt the storytelling and the landscape that the sport needs to have eyes, attention, and engagement with it, in your mind?
I think it's a major thing, and I actually brought this up at the commissioner's address last year at the Grey Cup, because it's not the Canadian Football League's fault. I mean, it's not like people have lost interest in football. It's that the media landscape has changed so dramatically, and there are fewer people covering sports. And so the biggest properties, NHL in this country, NHL, NBA in Toronto, sort of the NHL across the country in 7 markets, that's where newspapers and media outlets are putting their resources and saying, I mean, even sports like Toronto FC, aren't getting, daily coverage or a lot of times because, that's Major League Soccer, but it's down the totem pole in terms of, where these sports rank. And look, I have been at a lot of CFL venues where I'm the only guy, or there's the team reporter is there as well, which is, teams have started hiring their own reporters, not so much to control the message, but just to make sure there's somebody there covering them and putting out a message. So I do think this is a major, major source of concern. And I think it's something the league may have to take more ownership on as we go along here. And, it's funny because I comment my friend Steve Simmons of the Toronto Sun, who is, a longtime CFL guy, grew up at the knee of his father, who was an Argo diehard. And Steve was at the Argos last week writing a Wynton McManus column. And I said to him, you're basically the only one in mainstream media writing a national column on the CFL ever. Like I don't think everything else that's coming out about the league is coming out locally, but nationally, it's Steve Simmons and no one right now in this country, other than again, the broadcast partners, TSN are writing those kinds of things. But I'm talking about media that doesn't have a business relationship with the league, and that is I think very, very scary, and it's happened very, very fast.
Is there a solution to it? Does the league have to take ownership of it? If I take a look at Quebec, for example, one of the reasons why there is success at the college level in Quebec is that in each of those towns, there's still reporters covering college football on a daily basis in those places. How can the league in English Canada offset this outside of the outstanding job that TSN does, of course?
Well, and I'll give you a shout out to 3 Down Nation as well, as a website that covers the minutiae and the daily of the CFL. And a lot of their people are doing things on a part-time basis. They're not full-time sports writers, but they are certainly filling a niche right now in this country. So I certainly give them some measure of respect. Look, I think, I do have an idea about this one. And if I was, retiring, which I'm not, hopefully not, it's the kind of thing I think somebody should do. And that is, I think you need a website basically called, CFLreporting.ca or CFLbeats.ca, and hire beat writers in all those cities, where the league might have to, again, one thing about what's happened to journalism, there's no shortage of really talented young people who want to work in this business that you wouldn't have to pay a ton of money to, at least out of the gate. And I think I could certainly see, like, if you asked me to, and you did ask me the question, solve this problem, I would say, I think you have 9 beat writers, and there's some versions of this already happening when you look at what, say, Ed Tate does in Winnipeg. That's pretty close to an in-house beat writer writing it very traditionally, kind of the way he did all the years he was at either the Winnipeg Sun or the Winnipeg Free Press. But I think you need that presence in every market. And, and hey, the league can turn this, even if they don't make money off it, if they with advertising and the revenue you can generate through media, even if you could just break even, or I think the investment would be worth it for the league to have, somebody at practice every day, having somebody at a team 3 days a week, giving that beat coverage, writing about the players, telling their stories. Again, a lot of the 9 CFL teams do this to different degrees. But I think there would be certainly a case to be made that you could create a central hub for that, where it's nothing but CFL beat writing, in the traditional sense, the sense that you and I grew up on, and the sense that I think we all miss. And I've noticed it, Jim, just even when I haven't done a lot of CFL game panels this year, but the 2 years previous to this, I did a lot of them. And, I'd sit down a lot of times. Okay, this is Calgary playing Edmonton. Let me sit down and on my computer, and there's not that many stories from the week out of Calgary and Edmonton about these teams. So even for people in broadcast, trying to rely on the local beat writer sometimes for coverage and information, that information isn't there.
Dave, before I let you go, Kurtis Trophy, will you be a voter this year?
I absolutely will. Would love to.
There you go. We'll bring you back around the table again. Thanks very much for this. Thanks for taking time out in the middle of what looks like an extended summer in Ontario.
Yeah, we are second half of October and living large on the weather here, no question. Thanks, Jim.
When we come back, Games of the Week. And welcome back. Final segment of Gridiron Nation on TSN. Time for Games of the Week. You picked some doozies last week, Gord. Are you still on the woo-woo UNLV train?
Well, it's hard not to be this week because a game that has been looming for a while and probably the biggest Mountain West game this season, in the regular season at least, is this week. And it just so happens for our purposes that we have guys on both sides of it because it's Boise State and UNLV. This is a rematch of last year's Mountain West Championship game. These are clearly the two top teams in that conference, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, I would point out. Boise State ranked number 15 in the country. UNLV still not in the top 25 yet, but right at the fringes of it, sitting at just one loss. So they have a chance to make a real statement here. And we mentioned him earlier on the program, but figuring out a way to stop Ashton Genty is going to be huge. UNLV, I don't think anybody doubts that they can gun with anybody on offense, but I think the real doubt is whether their defense is going to be able to hold up in front of some of the better offenses that they face. And Ashton Genty is going to be a challenge that they have not seen yet this season, and as we alluded to before, probably couldn't see before this season. He's kind of one-on-one. Jet Elad had another great week this past weekend. He's had a couple in a row, really racking up tackles and getting his nose in there and making plays for the UNLV defense. So he'll be looking to be part of that charge. And then on the flip side, our guy Ty Benefield continues to be a stalwart on the Boise State defense, who's going to look to put the caps on. And this is where Benefield gets interesting. Put the caps on one of the best receivers in the country, and Ricky White III, and a really explosive offensive attack. So this should be a great affair. That one goes Friday night. And then Saturday, one of the main events across the country, we also have some skin in the game. It's number 8 LSU traveling to Kyle Field, to play Texas A&M, number 14 in the country. Both these teams at one loss. LSU's been great since their opening weekend loss to USC. They have won 6 straight since then, and they are really getting the wheels rolling. You always knew this team had the talent to compete at the top end of things, but it was just a question of whether they could finish games effectively. That was what Coach Brian Kelly talked about early in the season. They've cleaned that stuff up quite a bit. Garrett Nussmeier, CFL fan, son of Doug, is their starting quarterback, and he's really gotten things rolling as well. And then our guy Parrish Shannon on defense, number 0, had a sack and another tackle for a loss this past week and a big win for them. He's starting to increase his level of play as he adjusts to the SEC as well. So there's some really good stuff going on to watch for in that one too.
Thanks very much for that, Gord. For everyone on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, let's get out to the game.